Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 16, Evaluating Sources Using CRAAP. Like I have mentioned in Core Lectures 14 and 15, I do apologize if the audio is not up to par. Next week should be different. I will be with my own recording equipment back at home, and I won't be traveling for a conference. So, again, thank you so much for your patience and understanding on this. And I hope it's not terribly distorted on your end. Okay, lecture assignment materials. So you are going to need access to one source for Project 3 and a document to write on. All right, so before we jump into things, you'll need the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to your weekly homework document, as well as access to one source for Project 3. All right, the purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. There we go. We're going to discuss the need for source evaluation in academic writing. We're going to define the components of CRAAP, or the CRAAP principles of evaluation, and we will examine critical questions and concerns when evaluating sources. All right, why do we need to evaluate sources? I will tell you, and it is pretty much just fake news. Not that we need to evaluate sources, that's not fake news, but we need to be critical in our evaluation because of fake news. Now, with the emergence, especially of social media as a publication circulation platform, that really has given anyone the opportunity to say anything that they want and share it with potentially large audiences. And because of how a lot of these sites are set up, there isn't a ton of, for lack of a better term, quality control. There isn't a lot of, oh, this is a lie, or oh, this is inaccurate. Those kind of features are not common on many social networking sites or blogging sites as well. And unfortunately, that has allowed for false or severely misleading information to circulate at an unprecedented rate. And so we want to be very weary of the type of content that we are using to inform our opinions. And it's also worth noting, even though we won't discuss it in much detail, but especially with popular media, a lot of the publications have become partisan in their own respect, and that's not necessarily new, but it is something that you want to be aware of. And of course, there's a difference between being partisan and having sort of a particular ideology guide your argument, and there's a difference between fake news, which is basically just circulating stuff that is not true or so misleading that it pretty much reads as false anyway. So in addition to fake news, we also want to be aware of partisan or hyper-partisan works. Typically in academic articles, you won't run into that at all. It would be I'd be very surprised if you did. But this is especially important with more popular sources. But all the same, let's talk about how to evaluate these sources that we come into contact with. All right, there are a few ways that we can go about this, but in all honesty, I think the CRAAP method of evaluation is probably the most effective, most helpful that we have at our disposal. What this allows us to do is to create a checklist of things that we want to ensure are on par with what makes a source credible, what makes a source appropriate to use. Now, when we think of the word CRAAP here, it breaks down to currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. By these words alone, some of these terms should be familiar because we've talked about authority, and in some degrees accuracy. When we talked about ethos, we've talked about purpose with a rhetorical situation. So you can really call back to concepts that we've discussed earlier on in the semester and see how they might help you as you evaluate the different sources you come into contact with. So let's look at each of these in greater detail. Currency. Unfortunately, this one does not have anything to do with money. At least I don't really think it does. How we though could pitch this is to say, currency, not money, but currency as in time. Is it current? Is it up to date? Is it accurate? So really what this comes down to, the timelessness of the information. It's important to remember that topics can vary in their time sensitivity. So if you're looking at a more philosophical or humanities-based concept, you can more than likely pull from authors who wrote back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and it still be current. It could still be a guiding voice in the discussion that you are wanting to join through your own argument. However, if you are looking at perhaps a more fast-paced discipline, tech, certain sciences, and even social sciences can be very quick to change, especially in regards to the technologies available for allowing them to conduct research. So, for example, while if you're writing a paper on, again, more of a philosophical concept, yeah, you can totally quote a philosopher from the 1920s, and that might be perfectly appropriate and current for that field. However, let's say you are writing about net neutrality. Well, net neutrality didn't exist in the 1920s, so obviously that's out of the question. But if we're looking at it through how quickly this information can update and the concepts around it can change, even looking at an article from 2007, 2008 on the idea of net neutrality might be outdated. Perhaps the furthest back that you can go by saying, yeah, this is current and this is relevant, might be 2013, 2014, within the last 5 or 6 years. So it's important to be aware of the discipline that you're writing in and what their idea of a valued currency looks like. Are they cool if you reach back decades and perhaps even centuries, depending on your topic? Or do they really want you to stick to the most up-to-date available scholarship that the field has to offer? When we think about currency, a great question we can ask ourselves is the information outdated? So, going back to our example of net neutrality, if we are reading an article from 2018, we could say, no, this isn't outdated. This reflects the ongoing conversation regarding what's happening with net neutrality right now. But if we looked at an article from 2007, 2008, it might say, hey, we're talking about this idea called net neutrality. Excited to see how it works out. Excited to see where it goes. Obviously, that's very outdated because, there isn't a lot of formal research on it. Things have changed since, perhaps its inception. So you want to ask yourself, is the information outdated or is it still relevant and would it still support the point I'm trying to make? Relevance, that's the next one we're going to look at. This is the importance of the information for your reader. When we think about the type of evidence, and we'll get into in greater detail what that means when we get into Project 4 and we look at argument structure, but basically the sources that you're citing to support your own thoughts or your own ideas. So you want to consider what information and evidence your reader values. So for example, let's say you are writing to the medical community or you're writing a paper on the medical community or who you see as being your audience, the medical community. So you might say, okay, well, my audience of doctors and nurses probably don't care too much to hear about like essential oils or other type of more non-medical treatments for things. So if I say, oh, according to so-and-so who does these kinds of sort of home treatments or home remedies, that might not align with their values. Whereas they might value, seeing formal studies in medical facilities, perhaps as well as at, big universities that are known for their research. So you really want to ask yourself to say, well, what kind of information is my audience going to privilege? What are they going to say? Oh yeah, that makes sense. Or, oh, I totally accept that as a form of evidence. So when we think about that, we can sort of break it down into two camps, empirical data versus abstract theory. So we could also look at it in terms of, are we doing experiments? Is my audience going to value like the experiment, or the formally conducted survey where there's hard data, where there's numbers, where there's things that we can record and retest and go about in that way? Or is abstract theory more appropriate? Because, if you're writing on some philosophy or philosophical concept, you can't really test that in a lab. And so using that kind of approach as evidence for your audience might not be appropriate for philosophers. Rather, they're going to say, no, give us the abstract theory. Give us, the less concrete, quantifiable data, and give us something a bit more abstract. There are also a couple other things that we can think about. Is it a personal narrative or impersonal collected data? So this will be especially important if you are researching a topic either in the social sciences or in the humanities. So, because those both personal narratives and impersonal collected data, so like an interview or a survey or a poll or something along those lines, they both are going to appear, they're both likely to appear in the articles you encounter. So you just want to be careful to say, okay, well, would my audience prefer more of a personal narrative to guide the piece? A single story to say, let's say we are talking about, let's go back to net neutrality, right? So if we're writing for more of a legal audience that might be more philosophical in nature, maybe they're going to be more interested in one case study of when someone had a difficult time accessing Canvas because Canvas was throttled because of the results regarding net neutrality, right? So maybe they're more interested in that single personal narrative, or maybe they would, another audience, perhaps a tech audience, might be interested in seeing, 70% of people after, net neutrality was tinkered around with reported that they were unsatisfied with their internet searches because the sites they wanted to visit weren't loading properly. And so you really want to be considerate of your audience and think, what would they find appropriate? What would they find relevant? Authority. Now, this is when I said we can circle back to Aristotle and his idea of ethos. That is going to be the source of the information. So who is the author? Who is publishing this piece? So again, this really comes back to ethos. When we think about this ethos, though, this is very much, again, going back to week 1, this is not the teenager citing the priest when speaking to the congregation. This is the priest themselves speaking to the congregation. So that's how we can very much approach the authors whose authority we're evaluating. Some questions to help us with gauging the authority of these authors would be, why is this person considered an authority in their field? What does their education look like? What kind of similar works have they published? What kind of research have they previously conducted or engaged with? And what about that makes them an expert by their peers? You could also ask yourself, why is their research viewed as valuable? So why do people care? Why would your readers want to value this source as a form of evidence in your own argument? And you also want to ask yourself, are there any issues regarding the author's other works I need to account for? In some fields in academic writing, especially, you will find people who will go back, especially very prolific academic writers whose careers span decades. You could say, well, way back in the day, they said this, now they're saying that. So do I need to be aware of that and explain that to my reader if they say something now that might contradict or challenge what they said, back in 1987? The next that we'll want to consider would be accuracy. Now that's going to be the reliability, truthfulness, and correctness of the content. So this is so important for avoiding fake news in academic writing. You want to make sure that the information is on point. With academic writing, though, and with the academic works that you are going to use for projects 3 and 4, luckily, I don't think this will be as big of an issue as it might be if I were to say supplement everything with popular sources. But again, because that information is so heavily vetted for academic works, the accuracy is pretty much guaranteed, but it is something that we want to, of course, take into consideration. So if we think about examples of inaccuracy, vaccines cause autism. Okay, there are no scientific studies. That's just someone's opinion or someone's theory on that. And so because there are no studies, and the only study that has been done on this topic or that has supported this argument has been debunked several times over, there's no support for it. So it would be inaccurate or it'd be fake news. Also, you want to keep an eye out for something like the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1785. No, it wasn't. It was signed in 1776. So that would be kind of a smaller example, but still equally important example of inaccurate information or fake news, because that information is just flat out wrong. All right, and finally, we want to look at purpose. Remember that we examined purpose when we looked at rhetorical situations and rhetorical contexts back in week 1 or week 2, one of the first few weeks of the course. Well, now we can take that understanding of purpose and use it for evaluating, again, the effectiveness of a text. So you want to think, why does this information exist? So what drew this person to do this study? Or to write this paper? What are they writing in response to? Who are they writing for? Things of that sort. And this asks you to critically examine the biases of the author or the situation. So this can be incredibly important, especially if you are researching a polarizing or hyper-partisan topic. You want to check the biases to say, okay, well, is this person coming from a certain ideology that would perhaps skew the results of their study or lead them to develop their argument in a way that sort of fits their own needs rather than just genuinely contributing to the discussion in whatever way that happens to unfold. So some questions that you can use to sort of guide yourself through examining the purpose would be, why does this research exist? So what is it in response to? So right now, for example, we can look at the issues with the e-cigarettes, the Juul pods, I think specifically. So if we were to look at that to say, okay, well, why is this research just all of a sudden coming up and out of nowhere? Okay, well, we could say, well, there are a significant more number of deaths than there have been, even though these products have existed for a while, the number of deaths have skyrocketed in comparison. So maybe that's why this research exists. You could also look at who funded the work. Going back to that e-cigarette example, there's going to be a huge difference if, let's say, a tobacco company decides to sponsor a study on how e-cigarettes are bad versus, let's say, the federal government or the state of Utah or the state of Nevada or whatever. Because if this company who is in direct competition with e-cigarettes is funding research to say why e-cigarettes are bad, we can definitely, from right then and there, we can see those biases. However, if it is the federal government or perhaps a state government or a health-based group, we could say they are doing it for the interest of the general public because they really want to know what is causing these deaths. Are there any ways that we can intervene either through legislation or through just citizen engagement? And then you can also think who is served or who directly benefits from this work. So going back to that example, if it is a tobacco company funding the research on why e-cigarettes are bad, or finding the flaws in e-cigarettes, you know, you could say, okay, well, this serves the tobacco company more than anyone else, because now this research is going to say don't use e-cigarettes, but come smoke our cigarettes if you need your tobacco fix. But if we were to look at it from the perspective of perhaps federal government, local governments, or some type of health-related organization, we could say arguably, well, the benefit is for all of us. So we can collectively figure out what's going on, why the deaths have increased significantly. And so that way, again, if there are things that need to be done, we can take those necessary steps. So you do want to think who's benefited, who benefits or is served through that work. What I will say is, as you are evaluating, especially for purpose, strive to find sources that are meant to serve or benefit the general public, not a particular group or organization or especially company. Again, with academic works, you won't run into a ton of corporate sponsorship, but depending on your field, you might. So this is something that you'll definitely want to keep on your radar. All right, lecture assignment. I'd like you to locate one source that you could or plan to use for Project 3. I want you to compose a brief write-up evaluating the source. Each component's write-up should be about 30 words, and I will say keep this content as you can use it as drafting materials for Project 3. Remember, with the annotated bibliography, I would like you to use the CRAAP principles as a way to evaluate and annotate your source. So really, you could see this as sort of a rough draft to your rough draft. All right, so for your weekly homework, be sure to include the Core Lecture 16 summary and assignment. Overall, you'll want to submit the summaries and assignments for Core Lectures 14 through 16, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. That's all due to Canvas before 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, October 13th. If you have any questions or would like to discuss any of these concepts in greater detail, please don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas DM. All right, everyone, until next time.